Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I think it's very important for the United Kingdom to show leadership on the climate challenge. It's a very important challenge of our time. It's also, I've long believed, the single biggest opportunity for the next generation of jobs. There's a global race on for the jobs of the future in renewables. I'm absolutely determined that the UK is not just going to be in that race, but we're going to be winning that race, because that race is measured in well-paid jobs across the United Kingdom. That's the single most important thing as far as I'm concerned.
So the Prime Minister says that leading on green investment is a huge opportunity. He's keen to portray Britain as a leading green champion. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. So plenty of air miles being racked up this week with another round of COP talks, this time in Baku in Azerbaijan. Fun fact for you, Caroline, 5.5 hours from London.
I didn't realise it was that close.
It's quite surprising, isn't it?
Keir Starmer, who's been coming in for a bit of flack lately for spending so much time abroad, has decided to go to this COP summit and that it's worth his time.
Yeah, he's actually the most significant G7 leader to be delivering a speech at the conference. And if I may put the case for the defence, he does have a point about UK climate actions. If you look at the report of the latest report of the UK's Climate Change Committee, the UK's met all of its targets so far. Total emissions have been halved since 1990, and we're roughly halfway through on our path to get to net zero by 2050. And that recent announcement that we're the first countries to entirely stop using coal for power generation. We have actually decarbonised our power supply surprisingly rapidly. Lots of countries in Europe are still burning a huge amount of coal to produce their power.
Yeah, look, that's all great, but you can't talk about the politics of climate change without mentioning the constantly shifting promises from politicians. And there have been some howlers. The Conservatives' 2030 target to phase out fossil fuel vehicles had to be pushed back to 2035. Then remember the Labour Party's £28 billion of green funding for investment for green jobs that Keir Starmer was talking about just there? Well, that had to be pulled. And despite hosting the Glasgow COP summit, which was only 3 years ago, climate scientists actually rate Britain's green actions as insufficient. And same as that CCC, that Climate Change Committee report, they've got a long list of requirements: building more offshore wind, installing heat pumps in UK homes, and increasing electric vehicle usage. So they really do want to see the UK doing much more.
Well, let's get some more now from the conference itself. COP is the biggest annual conference on climate change, of course. It was established when 197 countries signed the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the meetings happen every year. Some years, though, are more significant than others. This year's COP is being held in the oil-dependent nation of Azerbaijan. The second year in a row, of course, that it's being held in a petrostate, and one that's been very important to Europe since Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Joining us now from Baku in Azerbaijan is our Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor, Joumanna Bercetche. Joumanna, thank you for being with us. So what is the aim then of discussions at this year's COP29? Why does this COP matter?
Thank you. The background to all of this is COP29 was never going to be as big as last year's COP in Dubai or the upcoming COP that's going to take place in Brazil next year. It's been dubbed the Finance COP, as negotiators are hoping to develop plans to unlock more financial resources to both aid with the transition and help countries adapt to the effects of climate change. Now, one area of particular focus will be the amount of money that goes from rich countries to developing countries. And this is an acronym known as the NCQG, the New Collective Quantified Goal. This was a target that was set back in 2009. The goal was for rich countries to provide $100 billion annually of loans and assistance to developing countries. And by the way, the year is 2024. That goal has only been met once, and it was met in 2022. Now, the target for this COP29 is for that number to be revised upwards. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because estimates range from $300 billion annually to north of trillions of dollars annually that is needed in assistance to help with these developing countries, coming at a time, of course, where many fiscal budgets are coming under pressure. And of course, you have to take into consideration the geopolitical backdrop with wars raging in Europe, the Middle East, China-US tensions running high, and of course, the re-election of President Trump as well, which could all sort of take the agenda away from the focus of this COP, which is financing and delivering on prior commitments, as opposed to some of the other things that are happening in the world right now that are diverting leaders' attentions.
So finance very much in focus. Joumanna, who's at the conference, and more importantly, who's not there? Any notable absences?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, it's slightly smaller COP in nature than usual. I mean, I say smaller, but they are still expecting more than 60,000 people from all over the world to be here, policymakers, leaders, delegations. But there are definitely fewer world leaders. Sir Keir Starmer is here. The Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, is also here. I spoke to him a short while ago. A notable absence of leaders from China. President Xi is not here. President Biden is not here. Chancellor Scholz, President Macron not attending. And then Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is here as well. So you are getting a decent turnout from senior leadership, but many leaders from around the world have decided not to attend this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. So then the other thing to mention, of course, the shadow of President-elect Donald Trump. How much is that looming over discussions? Obviously, you said President Biden is not there, but neither is President-elect Donald Trump, and he is still a strong climate skeptic.
Even though President-elect Donald Trump is not here, his presence looms large, and it has been a topic of conversation for every single one of the discussions that we've had, namely because if you look back over the last couple of years, the U.S. actually has led the way on many of these climate efforts. The U.S. gained a lot of credibility with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and the very return of President Trump throws a lot of that leadership into doubt. Remember, this is a president who ran on a campaign of drill, baby, drill, wanting to increase the amount of fossil fuel production that is coming out of the U.S. He has talked about repealing subsidies, tax cuts on some of the clean energy initiatives that are in place, repealing some of the incentives to buy electric vehicles. And then of particular note and of concern is one of the first decisions that President Trump took back in 2017 was to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris 2015 Accords, which enshrines that 1.5 degrees global warming target. Should he do that again? It again raises a lot of questions about where leadership on reducing emissions is going to come from in the absence of the U.S. And some people are even concerned about him going one step further and entirely pulling out of the UN framework, which makes it very difficult for the U.S. to get back into the framework again, because that would require a 2/3 Senate majority approval. So yes, it definitely has appended a lot of the discussions that are taking place here.
Just give us a temperature check, if you'll excuse the pun, on how the world is doing on the green transition. It's expected this year will be the hottest year ever, the first full year to surpass 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels when it comes to the global temperature. But how is the world doing when it comes to that process?
Unfortunately, the world is not doing well. At COP28, so this was the COP that took place in Dubai, a global stocktake took place. This is the 5-year review of how the world is doing versus those targets that were set back in 2015 with the Paris Accord. We are way off target. You just mentioned global emissions rose to a new record in 2023. Scientists in the EU are saying that it's virtually certain that 2024 will be the hottest year on record. The International Renewable Energy Agency says that current country pledges could cut energy-related emissions by 3% by 2030. That's just 3% by 2030 and 51% by 2050. So the only way you're going to meet those goals is if governments actually deliver on the commitments that have been put in place. Some of the major commitments that came out of COP28 last year include the tripling of renewables by 2030, increasing energy efficiency, transitioning away from fossil fuels, and creating a loss and damage fund, discussions around methane emissions, and of course, securing that financing that we spoke about as well. So in the absence of them following through on those commitments, it does seem increasingly unlikely that we're going to be able to secure those objectives that were laid out in the 2015 Paris framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just thinking about, who is there. I know you've been speaking to a host of political leaders, business and climate leaders, but in and of itself, the hosting of this COP in Azerbaijan has been controversial. About 90% of Azerbaijani exports are oil and gas based. And this was also a criticism of the COP last year, as you mentioned, in Dubai in the Middle East. And what are your takeaways in terms of the concerns around greenwashing and what this shows, I suppose, about the process and the concerns around that?
You talked about attendance, and I think there are real concerns from not just climate advocacy groups, but leaders around the world that the actual location for this COP is set in Azerbaijan. This is the countries you mentioned, 90% reliance on hydrocarbons. More than 40-50% of the GDP is derived from the exports of oil and gas. So there is something to be said for the choice of this important climate discussion. But at the same time, I think in the last couple of years, there has also been a recognition that you need to have all stakeholders involved. These types of discussions can't just take place at a singular level. They have to be multilateral talks taking place at country level, but also introducing the energy companies. And actually at COP28 in Dubai was the first time you saw active participation from the likes of the biggest energy companies around the world. And you will also remember that back in COP28, new language was introduced in the communique vis-a-vis fossil fuels and the gradual phasing out of fossil fuels. Now, it comes with a lot of caveats, but the point is that I think there is a global understanding now that all stakeholders need to play their part, including some of the most serial offenders when it comes to emissions.
We mentioned some of the world's biggest oil companies. You spoke to the CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods, earlier. Just want to play a little bit of that interview.
Demand is at record highs, both for oil and for gasoline and diesel. And so the demand is out there today. The industry's been very effective at supplying that demand. I think that's what you're seeing. And fortunately for us, with some of the turmoil in the Middle East, that available supply has kept the markets fairly stable. And so it's less of a demand issue, and there's just a lot of supply.
Well, I mean, the irony is quite striking, isn't it? One of the world's biggest oil producers saying that demand's never been better. Business is booming for ExxonMobil. There's a certain incongruous nature to this, isn't there? Has the whole event just become a talking shop for the world's oil producers?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, I did ask him a question about the macro outlook for oil. So that was his response. And he was saying, which I thought was quite interesting, that energy demand has never been so high. And one of the big themes in general for the energy industry has been these new marginal sources of energy demand. AI is a big theme because of all of the consumption, the energy consumption that is required out of data centers. And so you extrapolate many decades ahead, and energy demand will continue to rise. But the question is, how do they meet that demand? And is that going to necessitate a move away from fossil fuels towards cleaner, greener energy sources? Or are we going to stick with the same old? And it comes back to that discussion of when we hit peak oil demand, does it then drop off dramatically afterwards? Or does it sort of plateau around these levels? And these are all important discussions in the context of these climate talks, because ultimately this is about emissions reductions. The CEO, Darren Woods, at another part of our conversation was saying it's not just about emission reduction, but also about carbon intensity as well. And if you can introduce the technology to reduce carbon intensity, then that also is going to go a long way towards reducing global CO2 emissions as well. But coming back to what I said about the fossil fuel language in COP28, the caveat was that, yes, they agreed on a phasing out of fossil fuels, but the transition has to be done in a just, equitable, and orderly manner. That's the wording, open to interpretation. And therefore, you can select how fast you want to move away from fossil fuels. And that, again, is one of the areas that many of these climate advocacy groups are pushing back on and saying the lack of transparency or the openness on that statement isn't going far enough.
One could also say it not just as an irony that the oil producers are there, but simply as highlighting how difficult the move is to alternative energy as we now get really to the crunch point, the implementation phase of these hard-fought climate agreements. So the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, telling reporters, I will be making an argument powerfully that now's the time for the private sector, in the Prime Minister's words, to start paying their fair share. And it's high time that they played their part in this. But that's the difficulty, isn't it? It's who pays for the transition and how fast it happens.
So I actually just sat down with the World Bank president, Ajay Banga, and I put that very same question to him. I said, look, the starting point is 100 billion. Think tanks estimate that we need trillions of dollars. Where is that money going to come from? Is it going to come from the multilateral banks? He said, it can't come from us. We don't have that capacity to lend. It can't come from government budgets. They don't have that capacity to lend that much. It has to come from the private sector. So what you need to do is to create the right conditions for the private sector to be involved. And the World Bank are doing a lot of work on this front. You're going to hear a lot about blended finance, that's sort of public-private finance working hand in hand, with the public sector de-risking some of the concerns that the private sector have about investing in developing markets. And there's been a big focus on that. And so I think if we want to end this perhaps with a silver lining, the funding is there. The private sector are sitting on capital that's waiting to be mobilized. And now it's about creating the conditions that entice private sector money to come into the sectors that need it the most. And the World Bank president seems to think and believe that they can create the right conditions for that to happen.
Bloomberg's Joumanna Bercetche, thanks so much for joining us from Baku. Now, it all seems to me, Caroline, this comes down to money as usual, doesn't it? Not just how we raise the money to fund the transition within our own country, but also the balance between poorer countries and richer countries. And this is an ongoing debate which comes up every time at all these COP talks, is, who pays? And poorer countries are often affected greatly by climate change. So they say, why should we pay? We haven't created the emissions in the first place. And they want the rich to chip in more. And there's always that conflict. Yeah.
And look, if we're to have a chance of getting global warming under control, there have been agreements between governments, the finance industry, the major polluting companies, big tech, about reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that have been accumulated in the atmosphere. But actually, we're still a long way off, reaching those targets by 2030. We are off track at the moment. That is the main conclusion in terms of getting those greenhouse gases under control. And that was before the re-election of Donald Trump. So everybody is really going to be thinking about what the US leadership is going to mean for the world that is already falling behind in terms of its climate change goals.
Yeah, of course, the US, the world's second biggest carbon emitter, but also a country which, of course, many countries look to for leadership. So, how that changes in the coming months and years is going to be absolutely a key focus.
That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker, and we'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.